Welcome to this rapid revision video on exam skills. This will be looking at the Pearson Edexcel Paper 1. The topic we'll be studying will be medicine based, specifically the British sector of the Western Front 1914 to 1918. The question will be question 2a, how useful are the sources? Worth 8 marks. Although we'll be focusing on a medicine topic, the skills involved with this should be useful whatever topic you're looking at with the Pearson Edexcel paper. So let's proceed. Firstly, a few details about the Pearson Edexcel Paper 1. It has two main components. The first is the historic environment component, the source inquiry. Notice that you'll have a sources booklet enclosed and you'll need that for this style of question. And then there's the thematic study, medicine in Britain circa 1250 to the present. The length of the exam is 1 hour and 15 minutes, unless you're entitled to extra time, and that's for both sections. So make sure that you measure your time and you use it well. This particular video will be going into lots of detail about the skills involved with this question, and I don't want to give the impression that it's any deal longer than most other 8-mark questions, but we're just going to be unpicking the skills a little bit more and showing you how to do it. So hopefully you'll find that useful. Let's unpick the question first of all. Question 2a. Study sources A and B in the sources booklet, which you should have with you. We're going to be asking the question, how useful are the sources, A and B, for an inquiry into the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front? This question is assessing your source analysis skills, which is assessment objective 3, and it should take you about 12 minutes. You'll need to use your own knowledge to provide context. So here it says explain your answer using sources A and B and your knowledge of the historical context. You'll need to do all three of those things to get all 8 marks. So do be aware of that. The biggest mistake that you can make with this style of question is using the wrong sources. In this particular paper, it should be reasonably easy to tell which sources you should be using, but just make sure anyway. So use sources A and B. The next most common mistake here is that you don't refer to the utility or usefulness of the sources for the specified inquiry. Here I've circled the specified inquiry, which is the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front. If you're not focusing specifically on the work of the stretcher bearers on the Western Front, then you're going beyond the question and you won't pick up marks for that. You won't necessarily lose marks, but you can't be credited for anything that's not relevant to the question. So be careful. You should prepare by studying and, if you find it helpful, annotating the sources for a few minutes before commencing your answer. Often the first describe two features question, question number 1, is completed in under 6 minutes, buying you a little bit of time to do this. I'm going to demonstrate some skills now to help you to do that. You will not need to write things in as much detail as I'll show you, but this will help you to think about it. Here's our first source, source A. Remember that we should be focusing on the work of the stretcher bearers on the Western Front. So if you read something that's particularly useful and therefore relevant to this, then you should probably highlight it or underline it. You won't need to make as detailed annotations as I'm going to show here. Just give yourself little reminders so that you don't miss anything out. Before we read the source itself, it's really important to read the provenance or caption at the top. That can give us really big clues about its usefulness. Source A. From a letter written by a captain in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Alright, so this is probably a first-hand account or eyewitness account. He wrote the letter to his family in 1915. Again, I'm thinking this has been written quite early during the First World War. That probably makes it quite useful too. He was in charge of a group of stretcher bearers. Right, now that's definitely relevant to our inquiry. So again, that's a good sign. Here he's describing the work of his group of stretcher bearers after a German attack on the British trenches. So let's have a look at the source. Again, this would be a good opportunity to make a mental note of anything that's particularly useful. At 2 a.m, a terrifying bombardment began, and at 5 a.m, the first batch of wounded began coming down the communication trench. It was evening by the time I got out of the trench to look for more wounded. I went off with another man in search of the wounded. We found most of them in a wooded area, so weak that they could not call out. They were so relieved at being found that I led a search for more wounded. It was awful work getting them out of the shell holes. It was also hard to find enough men to carry them away because the stretcher bearers were so exhausted. Finally, we got our last wounded to safety at 4 a.m. in the morning. Altogether, we had collected 18 men in a single day, and we were certain that no one was left behind. Although I'll briefly mention some limitations too, I'm going to spend most of the time here talking about the usefulness. It's absolutely fine to put some balance in and consider the limitations, but the question's really asking you about the usefulness of the sources, so focus on uses more than the limitations. Let's consider the content. What does it actually say in the source? Well, there's quite a lot that's useful here. The source provides a real description of the work of stretcher bearers during a battle. It describes a high workload of the 18 men collected. Also, I can add to this using my own knowledge. The events described, with stretcher bearers working long hours under artillery fire, fits what I know about their role. And the provenance lends further use too. This was written by a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps who was a first-hand witness. It is written in 1915, so soon after the events described. They are likely to have been recalled accurately. Any limitations that might make this less useful? Well, there's maybe one or two. The source only describes one action in 1915, which may not be typical, and especially not typical of the whole war. This letter was also written to the man's family. He may have omitted certain useful details so as not to cause them distress. So that's a good annotation and quite balanced one of our first source. Like I say, you don't need to write in that much detail, but it may well give you a good idea just to make a few notes to make sure that you've used everything and to make sure that you've covered everything that you want to in the answer. Let's have a look at source B now. Here's source B. In this case, it's a painting. You can't guarantee that you'll get one picture style source and one written one, but in this case, that's what's happened. It's taken from the 2019 exam. Again, let's focus on the caption or provenance first of all. Source B, a painting by Gilbert Rogers, circa 1919. Alright, that's after the war, but not a long time after. The painting is called Stretcher Bearers of the Royal Army Medical Corps lifting a wounded man out of a trench. Yep, story checks out, that's exactly what I can see in the picture. Rogers joined the Royal Army Medical Corps in November 1915. Oh, okay, so Gilbert Rogers was actually in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He's not just an artist then, he's a first-hand witness, a bit like our previous author. And he served on the Western Front. In 1918, he was commissioned to produce paintings for the Imperial War Museum. Well, that's quite handy because that gives us a clue to the purpose of this as well, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Just like last time, we'll consider the uses and the limitations. And again, you won't need to write in this much detail, but just write down a few notes that help you to remember what you meant to cover. First of all, the content. This source depicts stretcher bearers working in difficult trench conditions whilst under fire. There are 4 men working with one stretcher. Also, from my own knowledge, this appears to reflect what I know about stretcher bearers working under fire in dangerous conditions. It also corroborates or backs up what we saw in source A. And also the provenance. This was painted shortly after the First World War by a former member of the RAMC who may have based it upon his experiences. The Imperial War Museum would likely want it to be a realistic depiction. After all, the purpose of the museum is to educate and inform their visitors, so having an unrealistic painting wouldn't really fit in with that. However, there are possibly some limitations too. As a painting produced after the war, it may be more representative rather than realistic compared to a photograph. It doesn't necessarily show a real event, rather one that represents the sorts of things that are going on. Before having a look at a sample answer, let's have a look at the exam board's own mark scheme, and this is what the examiner will be using to assess your work. There's the question again. How useful are sources A and B for an inquiry into the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your knowledge of the historical context. So that's why with the annotations earlier, I was writing in those bits about own knowledge. You'll notice that I've only included levels 2 and 3 here. There's also a level 1, but we don't want to be aiming that low, so instead let's have a look at the comparison between level 2 and level 3. See what the difference is so that you can aim as high as possible. So level 2 says that your judgments on source utility, so how useful they are, for the specified inquiry are given. So if you're not mentioning things about the work of stretcher bearers, you're not going to get level 2. However, what would be better for level 3 is that the judgments on source utility for the specified inquiry are given, but with further context as we'll come on to. Judgments are supported by a developed comment relating to the content of the sources and or their provenance. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do both to get level 2, but it probably means if you're going to get a high level 2, you will have done both. Compare that to level 3 though. You should have used developed reasoning, which takes into account how the provenance affects the usefulness of the source content. So what about the purpose or the author or the date might affect how useful the source is. For level 2, you do need to use some contextual knowledge. If you don't include any, you won't be getting level 2. But you have to be more specific for level 3. Contextual knowledge is used in the process of interpreting the sources and applying criteria for judgments on their utility. So perhaps recognising the significance of the date, or recognising the significance of who wrote it, or something that might be mentioned within the content of the source. Link it into what you already know to really demonstrate that you understand what you're reading. So without further ado, let's have a look at an example answer. So here's our question again. Remember that we need to be focusing on that inquiry about the work of stretcher bearers. I'm aware that this video is already over 10 minutes long. And no, you won't have that much time to deal with these sources before you get going, but I've tried to demonstrate some of the main ways that you do it, so I hope it's been time well spent. Remember that really you've got about 12 minutes, plus any time that you manage to gain from the short question in question 1 to write this answer in full. So here's a quick way of making sure that you've included everything that you need for the mark scheme. I call this JCOP, or Judgment, Content, Own Knowledge, Provenance. I've done the colour coding here so you can spot where I'm doing each thing within this sample answer. So let's get going. Source A is useful for an inquiry into the work of stretcher bearers as it provides a detailed account of their work during a battle in 1915. The source describes the process of removing the wounded from the battlefield and some of the difficulties, including finding enough men to do the job, avoiding enemy fire from the terrifying bombardment, and taking the wounded men out of shell craters. Notice that I've used direct quotes from the sources there, indicated by the quote marks. From my own knowledge, I know that stretcher bearers often had to work under enemy fire and that in difficult terrain it took 4 or more men to carry a single stretcher, which reflects the description in the source. This provenance makes it more useful overall. Although the officer may have omitted the most distressing details to protect his family, he was an eyewitness, writing soon after the event, suggesting that the details are likely to be true and realistic. That's not the complete answer, but let's see how I'm getting on first of all. So I've provided that judgment that the mark scheme asked me to do, and I've applied it to the content of the source and what I found out. I've considered my own contextual knowledge and applied logical reasoning whilst dealing with the provenance. So far, this is looking like level 3. But it's not level 3 yet because we've only dealt with source A. We need to deal with source B too and come to an overall judgment. So let's deal with source B next. Again, we're going to use judgment, content, own knowledge and provenance to structure our answer. Firstly, the judgment. Source B is also useful as it depicts the work of a team of stretcher bearers evacuating a wounded man under fire. The source shows a shell exploding in the background, while a team of 4 RAMC stretcher bearers struggle with a wounded man on a stretcher as they lift him out of a muddy trench. The wounded man appears to have a head wound, which would have required delicate handling. From my own knowledge, I know that this would be typical of the work of stretcher bearers, and indeed it is supported by the details described in source A, with many men needed to transport each wounded man. This provenance makes it more useful overall. Although it is a painting rather than a photograph of a real event, the artist was an RAMC soldier and he is likely to have based the painting upon his experiences, the memory of which would still be fresh in 1919. The Imperial War Museum would also have wanted an accurate portrayal for the museum to inform visitors. So again, I've given a clear judgment, I've backed it with content from the source, related it to my contextual knowledge and indeed the other source, and then justified this through an examination of the usefulness of the provenance. So all I need to do now is give my overall view of the usefulness of these sources, and I should have reached level 3. Now my overall judgment, a conclusion of sorts. Overall, sources A and B are very useful for understanding the work of stretcher bearers on the Western Front. Both sources show similar details, such as the number of men in the team and the dangerous and difficult conditions they are working in. This includes difficult terrain, enemy artillery, and needing enough men to move each stretcher. From my own knowledge, I know that this is indeed fairly typical of the work carried out by stretcher bearers on the Western Front, particularly during significant actions like the Battle of the Somme. Their provenance makes them more useful. While source A might omit distressing details to protect the author's family, and source B might omit details in the interest of decency in a museum exhibit, both are realistic depictions of the work of stretcher bearers produced by eyewitnesses. So before we move on and have a look at a how not to do it, let's consider, have I given a judgment here? Yes, I have. Is my judgment based upon their usefulness in relation to the work of stretcher bearers? Well, yeah. Look at how often I've used phrases that include something along the lines of the work carried out by stretcher bearers. and I've considered my own knowledge and the provenance in coming to that judgment. So that should be a high level 3, 8 out of 8, or at least I hope so. So I've given my judgment, I've considered the content of the source, I've related it to my own knowledge, and I've related it to the provenance. This is going to be an example of what not to do, but I'll still keep the same structure in place. Source B is reliable as it was produced by a person who was in the RAMC and so was there at the time. It shows the stretcher bearer is struggling with a wounded man in a muddy trench. From my own knowledge, I know that the trenches are often muddy, flooded and unhygienic, which was dangerous and unhealthy for anyone serving in them. The provenance makes it more reliable as it was painted very close to the time of the First World War by a man who took part, so he's unlikely to be biased. Okay, during the times before the 9-to-1 GCSE style, the old style exams, students would get marks for talking about reliability, mentioning things like bias and one-sidedness all the time. That's not really the case anymore. Just being able to say that something is unreliable isn't especially good if you've been asked to look at its usefulness. I'm not saying it can never happen, but when the question is asking how useful something is, you should be focusing on what makes it useful. And I'm going to tell you now, the examiner is never going to give you sources which are not useful. One of them might be more useful than the other, but they're not going to give you sources that are useless. That is going to be a waste of everybody's time. So assume that the sources will be useful if used in the correct way. Firstly, my judgment here is about reliability and not usefulness. I'm not going to get any credit for that. I will get a certain amount of credit for identifying this detail from the source, although it's not an especially insightful detail, is it? I'm not going to get any marks from this though, because my own knowledge is not related to the work of the stretcher bearers. That is a knowledge related to the conditions in the trenches. And finally, this provenance comment is related to reliability and bias and not usefulness. Again, that is not focused on the question. I'm sure your own teachers, which might be me, let's face it, will have been talking you through this, but just make sure that you are clear on this. Sometimes people assume it's going to be about reliability. It's not. It's about usefulness. And virtually every year the examiner's report contains that criticism. Some final points then. There's no doubt about it, how useful questions, when it's related to sources, require some careful thought. But you simply need to explain the usefulness of both sources in relation to the stated inquiry. As long as you keep that in mind, you can't go too far wrong. So consider the content, your own knowledge, and the provenance, and how this affects both the uses and possibly the limitations of the sources, but you should really be focusing on the uses. Come to an overall judgment. How useful are the sources? And if you need it, remember JCOP, judgment, content, own knowledge and provenance, if you need help structuring your answer. If you do that, you should be able to hit all the points that the exam board's mark scheme is looking for. Like I say, spend about 12 minutes on this question. A few minutes reading, labelling and annotating the sources is time well spent, especially if you've managed to save a couple of minutes from the first 4-mark question. Anyway, that's the end of this rapid revision video. It's not been one of the more rapid ones, but I do feel that there's been more to unpick with this one here, so I hope it's been time well spent. Don't panic about these questions, keep calm, make a few notes around the outside, and remember, focus on uses and focus on the inquiry. That's all for now. Thanks for watching, and if it's been useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. Best of luck in your exams, and goodbye.